Deep State over there trying to make the ending choppy. Welcome, happy Thursday, everyone. How are you guys? How is everyone? Today is going to be a Pascalist day. He could not make it today. So we have a deep bench. That's how you win championships. It's not defense that wins championships. It is a deep bench. So it's Foreign Policy Thursday. So, of course, I'm with my foreign policy homies. Coming all the way live from Missouri State University. He's everyone's favorite professor of all things Turkish. Mean Gene Bajlan.
Hey, how's it going, Jason? It's great to be with you here on Thursday. Really enjoying the new introduction. Baby Zal broke into the room and is jamming to it. He's a big fan of the heavy music.
He's jamming to the new heavy metal. That is actually a new song. It's an old song. We released it in Brazil only, so it's a new song for the new Bitter Lake record that's going to get released whenever the fuck I release it.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty cool.
And coming from the innards of British Columbia, you guys call him Deep State Cuba. We just call him Cuba. Cuba.
Hello, gentlemen. It's funny because in the deep state, they call me Dr. Cuba. But, you know,
Pascal is the only one who can say your name. Pascal made an effort to learn Cuba's surname.
Well, Pascal's just better than everybody then, isn't he?
Well, you know, it's because as a Pole, that's the next best thing to being Haitian.
And Pascal speaks, he actually speaks really good French, actually. Not that your name is French, he just does speak multiple languages. So I'm the only person here today that does not speak multiple languages. So I feel ashamed.
Nerd is a language.
I'll take it. So our guest today is the associate editor at the Electronic Intifada. She's also a co-host at the Brief podcast. She is also a fellow Albany High Cougar. I mean that as the mascot, not because she's officially hit that part. She's officially hit Cougardom. But before we introduce her, I made a little intro video for tonight. Let's check that out about what we're going to be discussing. Many of us have seen the devastating footage of thousands of far-right, flag-waving Zionist Israelis cheering the burning of a large cypress tree outside of historic Aqsa Mosque in Palestine. They were celebrating Jerusalem Day, the day in 1967 where Israel took control of the city, so they claim. Another shocking scene making its way around the internet is that of a Palestinian woman begging an Israeli settler not to steal her house. A claim that sounds absurd to the average American, but a precarious reality known all too well to the disenfranchised Palestinian people. Will Joe Biden ditch his career-long pro-Israeli stance and actually enact economic sanctions on Israel? What would a two-state solution look like for the Palestinian people, and is that even an option? Why has settler violence against the Palestinian people increased of late, and what can be done to address it? We'll ask these questions and more with our guest, associate editor and co-host at the Electronic Intifada, Nora Barrows-Friedman. This is Revolution.
How long? How long? How long? How long? How long? How long?
All right, so let's introduce, coming all the way from not too far away from where I am, Nora Barrows-Friedman.
Wow.
Hello.
All right.
I wanted to make it the best intro you've ever had for anything.
Hands down, the best intro.
And you've done a lot of intros, because if you look up this woman's name, you'll find her on several shows. several panels.
Too many.
You've been doing this for the majority of your adult life.
This is true. You know, as a cougar.
Go Albany.
Albany. Yeah, actually, I've been doing this for about 20 years, and does not get easier. That's for sure. But that's, you know, this is what I do.
And usually I'm here with my co-host, who I do have to say, he is a little upset he wasn't here today. He was very excited. There was a lot he wanted to discuss on this topic. There's a small chance that he might come in for the bonus half.
Good.
So since he is not here, I have two of our Foreign Policy Thursday hosts that are scholars. One is a Middle Eastern scholar, Jean Bajlan, in Cuba. Has worked extensively in the Middle East. So
Mostly for the deep state.
Really, he's not even trying to be funny. The man. He's literally the man. So do you guys want to start off with a question for Nora about what is going on in Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, let me open it up with perhaps you could give a little bit of context for this current escalation of violence, and particularly focusing on the land disputes that are taking place in East Jerusalem at the moment. I know there are several different kind of conflicts intersecting and sort of culminating at the moment, but it seems to many people that, at least from the international perspective, it was the Israeli High Court's decision over this sort of land rights issue in East Jerusalem that sort of helped propel this, you know, latest sort of round of conflict to international attention.
Yeah, well, so in order to provide accurate historical context, we have to go back to 1948 when Palestinians, as you know, 800,000 Palestinians were exiled, uprooted, and prohibited from ever going back to their home. So many of those Palestinians in 1948 were dispersed, you know, either to Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Europe, North America, or internally. They became internal refugees inside what would become the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Some of those refugees were able to secure a deal with the Jordanian mandate, you know, in the 1950s and 60s, where they were forced from their home in what is now present-day Israel. The Jordanians crafted a deal with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is the administrative body of the UN that deals specifically with Palestinian refugees, that they could move into occupied East Jerusalem. It wasn't occupied at that time, and that, you know, they would have the deeds to those properties. Of course, you know, Israel is the judge, the jury, and the executioner in the courts, and they have taken up the settlers' argument that they have no rights to that land, and that, you know, they were trying to strike a deal, I believe, a few days ago, last week. God, I can't even, the days are all a blur, that the settlers could, you know, permit the Palestinians living there in those homes, in their homes, to continue living there, but maybe they could pay the settlers rent, right? Of course, this is not a just solution. And of course, the settlers don't want to just have access to Palestinian homes in that tiny neighborhood. This is a stated intent of the settlers and these settler organizations to take one neighborhood after the next, after the next, after the next, until there are no more Palestinians. So the media and Israel, liberal Zionists, like to kind of frame the situation as, you know, a land dispute or like a property dispute or a conflict, a disputed territory. It's not. There's nothing disputed about this. This is Palestinians' land. These are Palestinian homes. These are Palestinian families who have been there for generations. And the settlers who want to uproot them have no leg to stand on legally. But of course, they're appealing to the Israeli courts, which have their back. So that was the context from which this is all kind of taking place now.
Isn't the decision of the Israeli Supreme Court, though, have a big potential backfire for Israel in the sense that it's my understanding that the legal claims presented by the settlers are that those particular territories and houses in East Jerusalem were owned by Jews before 1948 and before the unmixing of the population in Israel-Palestine. And thus, if they're going to recognize that particular legal right, surely that that would mean that you would have to recognize the right of return.
Right, exactly. For Palestinians.
The legal basis for that case is that these particular houses were owned by Jews before 1948, which is a dangerous legal precedent for the Israelis, because then they're opening the door to that. If we're going to start going back to before 1948 as the legal claims that predate 1948, surely that opens the door for people to have look a lot more sympathetically on the Palestinian right of return to territories behind the Green Line.
Yes, and therein lies the situation where, I mean, Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood itself is adjacent to the so-called Green Line, right? So right across the street, literally across the street, is West Jerusalem, where every single house in those neighborhoods in West Jerusalem belong to Palestinian families. So if Israel wants to enshrine, people's legal right to have homes that predate 1948, the entire Israeli project would crumble, and it should crumble. It's an ethno-state. It's a colony. It's an apartheid entity. It does not have the right to exist. Palestinians, on the other hand, have the right to go back to their lands and return to their homes, which are directly across the street from them, which they can't access because of Israel.
As a technical question, do Palestinians have, without Israeli citizenship, have standing to make that kind of case in Israeli courts?
Good question.
Because I imagine that's a technical issue that could easily solve the dilemma of, well, how do we make sure that this right only exists for Israelis?
Right. Well, the thing is that Israel has passed law after law after law, including the nation state law, which was passed, 2019, which basically enshrines it as a discriminatory apartheid state, where they actually say, this is a democracy only for Jews. And therefore, the hierarchy of power and property rights and all of this goes first to Jews who want to be there. Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel are subjected to more than 60 discriminatory laws on the books, where if they want to, for example, build a house somewhere, they have to apply for all of these permits that are subjected to really racist, kind of the equivalent of red zoning laws. They are not allowed to go ahead.
Does this apply to non-Jewish citizens of Israel or to the Palestinian?
To Palestinian non-Jewish, to Palestinian non-Jewish citizens of Israel.
So it's frankly just ethnic discrimination within Israeli
legalized
citizenship.
Legalized. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then you have the Palestinians under occupation with absolutely, no citizenship to the state of Israel. They're not citizens of anywhere. They have identification cards. if you're in the West Bank, you have a green card that gives you absolutely no rights under Israeli military occupation, let alone like property rights. I mean, not at all, not at all. As Human Rights Watch, as B'Tselem, as Palestinian human rights organizations have been saying, well before Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem came out with their reports recently calling Israel an apartheid state. I mean, it is South Africans who struggled under apartheid, including Desmond Tutu, including Nelson Mandela, including, Ronnie Kasrils. They've all said that this is worse, a worse apartheid than they suffered under South African apartheid.
Well, how can Palestinians get around the courts, or why would they even want to deal with the courts? Is it
they can't. They can't. They can't. I mean, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are subjected to Israeli military courts, right? Their neighbors in settlements in the occupied West Bank are subjected to Israeli civilian courts, right? And then Israeli citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel, are subjected to Israeli civilian courts, but they also have to go through this like long list of discriminatory laws. So their access to justice under this apartheid system is also intensely discriminatory.
And what is the legal status of the population of East Jerusalem, the population of East Jerusalem, considering that obviously we have Palestinian citizens of Israel behind the Green Line, and then in the occupied territories you have non-citizens. But of course, as we all know, Israel has annexed Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So what is the status of the population that lives there?
It's really interesting. The status of Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem, which is part of the West Bank, they obviously they can go in and out of Israel. Because Jerusalem, is connected, but they are not citizens. They are identified as permanent residents, right? And that permanent part is also subjected to change, because if they have to constantly prove to the state of Israel. Only Palestinians in East Jerusalem have to do this. They have to constantly prove to the state of Israel that Jerusalem is the center of their life, right? So they live there, they work there, they send their kids to school there. If they leave the country for any reason, at any time, for more than 6 months, that residency does not, it's not permanent anymore. It can be revoked, and they will never be allowed to live in Jerusalem again. So when Palestinians who have East Jerusalem residency fall in love with someone who has West Bank residency, the person with West Bank residency cannot come into Jerusalem to live with them. The person with Jerusalem residency can go to the West Bank to live with them. This is one of many ways that Israel is trying to control the demography, the demographics in Jerusalem, to completely push out Palestinians inch by inch. And not just like, these like humiliating bureaucratic measures, but also demolitions of houses, right? Demolitions of houses in Jerusalem. And once a home is demolished in Jerusalem, they can't get a permit to rebuild.
So there's a video that's pretty popular of an older Palestinian woman yelling at a man with a New York accent. Actually, he does not sound very Israeli. He actually, from what I understand,
Jacob from Brooklyn.
Apparently he's from Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And she says, "You're stealing my house," and he very flippantly says, "Look, if I don't do it, someone else will."
Yeah.
Can you explain that situation? Because that just seems, I mean, for the average American, that's a very odd situation. You're going to give me some context to that, please, on how can one steal someone's house?
I mean, it's not odd, because this is what Israel has been founded on. It's also very, I was listening to this great episode of the Palestine pod. I was a guest on it a couple months ago, and Stephen Saleta, the just extraordinary Palestinian American, former recovering academic and writer, he was saying, like, when you see that video of Jacob the Settler, talking to this woman whose house he's trying to steal and trying to, like, he says, like, what, if I don't take it, someone else will. Yeah. So, like, don't blame me. That the language and the body language and the audacity and the, like, arrogance in that is very familiar to Americans, right? It's like this, well, that's mine, I'm going to take it. And if I don't take it, someone else is going to take it. So it might
don't
as well
hate the player, hate the game.
Exactly. That's right. But actually don't hate the game, because we are entitled to that game as well. It's in the book that we wrote, sort of thing. And so to have, like, so for the settlers to have not only this, like, nation state behind you saying, yes, take their shit. Why not? This is what we're here for. Right. But also to have this, like, this ideology that God is also on your side. It's very manifest destiny. It's very 1492, right? It's like, these savages, they don't take care of the land. They don't understand our connection to it, even though this guy's, from Brooklyn and his ancestors are from, wherever, Austria. They believe this so thoroughly that they are more entitled to this woman's house than she is.
You bring up a comparison with Manifest Destiny and these other kind of colonial impulses. Yeah. The comparison that comes to my mind is actually World War II or World War I, where you have large-scale shifts in borders, which capture populations on kind of the wrong side of a national line, and then you have massive population transfers. Poles out of Ukraine, Germans out of Poland, the case of World War II.
Greeks out of Turkey, and Muslims out of Greece, formerly constituted,
And these, these countries get away with it partly because it's bilateral, or one side is just lost completely, so the victors dictate terms. But it also has to do with the fact that you do it quickly. It takes a year or two, and then it's done. And after 1949, the Israelis did that. They sort of purged the Palestinian population on their territory quickly. Then when they gained control of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they never settled on what to do with the Palestinians that they were now administering. And it feels like retroactively Benjamin Netanyahu has decided that ethnic cleansing, population transfer, whatever you want to call it, getting rid of these Palestinians is the proper policy for Israel. And it's really putting aside all the biblical window dressing. It's really, we won the war, right? Sorry.
Right. I mean, the biblical window dressing was a really convenient tool, because it was never about, like, realizing the yearning of the Jewish people to go back. Like, we were already there, like, Jewish people were part of Palestine for thousands of years. We were integrated into Palestinian identity, culture.
Isn't that what Golda Meir said years ago? She said that she had a Palestinian passport.
Right. I mean, this is the thing. Like, Palestinian Jews were part of the cultural and national identity. It was only when the European settler colonists, the Zionist movement, wanted to kind of, like, take part in the spoils of European colonialist, plans of the 19th century and early 20th century, that, Oh, they were secular. It wasn't religious to them. It was a power thing. They wanted to be colonizers. They wanted to bring Western European colonization to the Middle East. And so exploiting Judaism to this end was a really convenient tool for them.
And I think we see this quite commonly. We see like movements across the Middle East. I always think of the Armenian Genocide, which is portrayed as, you have the religious people, whether they're the Jewish settlers or the Muslim tribesmen, massacring religious people, but the actual individuals orchestrating this violence at the top are motivated by secular political ideologies. So, religious fundamentalists can serve as kind of shock troops for the sort of the national
That's
project.
exactly it. Yeah.
But the project itself has its origins in kind of in Israel's case, 19th century, a reaction to 19th century European anti-Semitism, particularly in places like Russia. And Israel, ironically, is kind of a re-reification of kind of racial notions of Judaism that became popular in the 19th century and early 20th century Europe, which had catastrophic consequences for the European Jewish population.
Yeah,
as we all know.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the artist Mr. Fish, Nora? Political cartoonist?
Yes. Yeah.
This is one of his newer images. I don't know if you guys can see it. I have it here on the main screen. The Israeli real estate agent.
Yeah.
Now you just have to imagine the room with the different color scheme, hardwood floors, and all these people homeless, and the 6-year-old shot through the head, and the rest of the family acting crazy, as if things could have been handled differently. So it's a very dark. A lot of his imagery is pretty dark.
No, but I mean, like I have friends whose whose grandparents were kicked out of their homes in 1948, and there are stories of little Jewish children who the state kind of gave these houses to, and the children. I think it's like a friend of my mom's who was a child in 1948, and she has this story of like walking into this house and there was still food on the table, right? There are still shoes near the door. There were still toys in the kids' bedrooms. So that cartoon is not far off from reality. I mean, people
I think
left and thought that they would be returning, 1-2 weeks later. They took their house keys, and the Israeli state stole everything and gave it to the settlers.
I think that there's one piece of context that might be helpful to understand, is that the Israelis leadership, that the first generation of Israeli settlers that arrived, had experienced the exact same thing from the other side during World War II.
Yeah.
And not only that, but it was somewhat par for the course world historically, that there were winners and there were losers. Warfare was common. Territories got conquered and people got expropriated. Aristocrats got expropriated in Russia. The bourgeoisie got kicked out of Havana. People lose their houses and they're given to somebody else.
Yeah.
And the important thing is not to be the loser in that. And since everybody was doing it, it was kind of okay. Decolonialists were doing it. Colonists were doing it. Communists were doing it. Fascists were doing it. Everybody was taking people's homes, kicking them out, and giving it to somebody else. And so it would have been less of a morally shocking policy for people who had experienced the other side of it and who had just took it for granted as the way that politics get done. It's ugly, it's unfortunate, but it couldn't be handled differently. But now a lot of the world has sort of moved on, where this is not really acceptable behavior anymore. But there's this, in a lot of ways, the Likud government Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli right, is stuck in a very 20th century kind of Machtpolitik mentality about what they can or can't do, what they should or shouldn't do, and the kind of world that they live in. I think that the Palestinians are suffering for it, and in the way that they're mobilizing world opinion, and they're trying to create an international movement on their behalf, like the apartheid metaphor, the apartheid parallel, is very telling, because that's kind of a early, it happened in the late 20th century, but it's kind of a 21st century style of politics. You don't necessarily fight them with guns. You mobilize opinion, you win the moral battle, then you can get some policy pressure, and then maybe you're the ones taking homes and redistributing them.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Palestinians they weren't responsible for the Holocaust, and yet they paid a very heavy price after World War II.
I'm not suggesting that there's a moral logic behind it.
Right.
It's not that there's a party that's virtuous, right? This isn't justice. This is just strength and weakness, winners and losers.
Yeah, I mean, I would also caution against kind of pinning this on the hard right, Likud party, or the fascist mobs in the streets. The so-called Labor Party of Israel was also involved in ethnic cleansing. There has never been an administration of the Israeli state that has not promoted the Zionist project of ethnic cleansing against Palestinians. It is baked into the pie. It is part and parcel of the political sphere. People kind of lionize Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin, the quote dovish, prime minister. He was the architect of the break the bones policy during the first Intifada. Right. So he instructed military forces to go into the West Bank and literally break Palestinians' bones against rocks. And he's regarded as this dovish, and all these settlements were expanding in the West Bank during that time as well.
But
go on, Gene.
No, well, the point I would make about this, and I don't know what you think, is I think this is not a 20th century mode of thinking. I think this is very much in keeping with the times, because I think, especially over the last decade, we've seen an intensification of states attempting to demographically engineer realities on the ground and complete national consolidation, whether that's India and Kashmir, whether that's what Turkey's been doing in northern Syria and in various other parts of the world. I think I think we're seeing a revival of this kind of. I think there's always been a kind of contradiction. I think, especially in the 90s, between the reality of ongoing Israeli settlers' expansion and the commitment, at least theoretically, of the Israeli state to a two-state solution. And what we've seen is now whether or not Israel was sincere about a two-state solution in the 90s, there was a plausible kind of discourse that you would go like, well, it's two states. Whereas after a decade of Bibi, that narrative is not sustainable anymore. And to talk about narratives again, from 1948 to 1979, there was a believable narrative that what you had was a plucky democracy of genocide survivors fighting against the armies of Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and fighting these ongoing wars for national survival against, hundreds of, millions of Arabs.
Preventing a second Holocaust.
Right.
And for a generation of people who grew up during the 60s and 70s, that narrative still exists. But what we're seeing, if you grew up in the 90s like myself and Kuba did, we didn't see, the Israelis, turning it around in the Yom Kippur War. We saw the first Intifada, and when we went to university, we saw the second Intifada, which I remember very well. I was at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London at the time, which is a center of Palestinian activism.
Yep.
Ariel Sharon marched on to the Aqsa Mosque and, helped trigger this. So I think, again, what we're seeing is like the plausibility of the narratives that have sustained Israel are collapsing. They still buy it on the right because the right look at Israel as the kind of ideal type ethno-state, but it's becoming increasingly difficult even for non-liberals to defend the state of affairs that is taking place for a variety of historical reasons.
Yeah,
I don't know your thoughts.
I totally agree. I think that especially like American liberal Zionists who may, especially like our parents' generation, who grew up in the 60s and they had this sort of like weird utopian vision of, the kibbutzim movement in Israel. And it was like a socialist utopia sort of thing. And the Arab situation, like we just don't talk about that. Or they were just like outright racist about it, but still, claimed to be liberals or progressives or whatever. They are really struggling right now. Thoughts and prayers to American liberal Zionists. Kidding, just kidding. Because the reality that is being video recorded minute by minute, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram Live, everywhere, Snapchat, it's still a thing. That reality contradicts completely what they thought about Israel. When you see I wrote an article today about media buildings in Gaza City being completely destroyed by Israeli missile strikes. Right, they destroyed a women's and children's health clinic. I can't even count the number of airstrikes that have happened in the past 4 days. More than 100 Palestinians killed. People on Twitter right now, people I know on Twitter right now are saying goodbye to people because they don't know if they're going to wake up tomorrow morning. And meanwhile, settler Jacobs all over Jerusalem saying the quiet parts out loud, revealing Zion, taking the mask off and saying like, we're going to take your house. We're going to take your house. We're going to take all the houses until there's no Palestinians left. That is the naked face of Zionism. And that is what Zionism always has been. It's been marketed in different ways, especially to appease American, liberal
tender
Jewish communities.
Sensibilities.
Absolutely. And now they're having a real moral dilemma. And I hope they keep having that moral dilemma enough I
wanted to switch gears real quick because we have like 20 more minutes left.
Yeah.
Joe Biden, since the early 70s, has been a strong proponent of Israel. Apparently, he met with Golda Meir, I want to say 73.
Yeah, because he's fucking 1,000 years old. Yeah, of course.
He is a little less than 1,000, but he is pretty old. I don't talk about old people, Nora, because we're officially old people.
I know.
And I'm older. I'm a year older than you.
You sure are.
I can fart and pull a muscle. That's how old I am.
This guy works out all the time, though. He's always in the gym.
And you should hear, I sound like an old guy at the gym. It's like,
No, I sit down and I'm like, oh God, I've turned into that.
It sounds like bubble wrap when I get up.
Sorry.
There's been a push through the BDS movement. Mm-hmm. Say what you will about that, to impose sanctions on Israel. Yeah. And Biden has been on record for decades saying that there's a video making the rounds of him from the 80s saying if Israel wasn't there, we would have created it.
Absolutely.
And it's worth the $3 billion that we, and it's, the number's even higher now. Someone says in the chat, fuck off, Biden.
Amen.
With all the talk of Biden moving left that you hear in right-wing media, do you think he is going to budge at all?
He's not moving left. bro, like if you look at the policies that Nixon was engaging in and supporting in the 1970s versus like what the Democratic Party is now, the Democratic Party and Biden is way to the right of the Nixon administration.
He was actually
domestic ways, you know.
He was in favor of the moving the embassy to Jerusalem as well. So that was.
I mean, Biden. This is the thing about the Democrats is Israel is a bipartisan issue, right? Everybody, the entire power elite structure of the Democratic Party is exactly in tandem with the supported policies of the Republicans. I mean, there is no like difference between the two parties when it comes to the Palestinians and support for Israel. I guarantee you that the Democrats have always supported whatever Israel wants to do, right? Oh, please don't do settlements. Okay, you can do some settlements, but not too many. Oh, you want to do more? Okay, well, here's another $3.8 billion check. There has been no consequences on Israel for the last 73 years for any of the human rights violations that it commits on an hourly basis, right? And so when Trump, in all of his arrogance, but honest American political arrogance, moved the embassy to Jerusalem, I swear to God, the Democrats were like, oh God, thank God he did it, because now we don't have to do it. Right? It would have looked really bad for the Democrats to have done that in a Democratic administration, but they are very happy to support that Trump policy. And Biden has reiterated that. He said he has no plans to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv. What does that tell you? Biden he and Kamala Harris are the most pro-Israel, pro-apartheid, pro-ethnic cleansing, pro-settler colonizing Democrats that you could ever hope for, that Israel could ever. Israel puts on this show that they, really hate the Democrats, and they were really upset with Obama, and they really love Trump.
Who was out there speaking in New York recently that was saying that the Democrats are too weak? It was a rally, a pro-Israel rally in New York. I can't remember the gentleman's name.
It's a great strategy, right? Like, you say that the Democrats are weak so that the Democrats will do more shit for you, right? That they were already going to do.
That's how you get the Democrats to do anything.
Yeah, exactly.
So you guys believe that people basically call the Democrats chicken and they go, I'll show you?
No, like, I think the Israelis genuinely
just when it comes to Israel.
No,
they didn't
when it comes to
it's Iran policy. Like,
that's why.
That's what
I want to get
as the representative
from
Washington, D.C., with the longest D.C. experience, Democrats, it's so easy to get them to buy into any aggressive military posture, any high military spending.
Yeah.
The fear of the wimp factor is so strong that all you have to do is like, what? You a pussy?
Right.
Not going to do that?
No, totally. And that's what they count on. That's what the Israeli Foreign Ministry counts on. That's what the Israel lobby organizations count on. And just like how they completely sacked Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, right? They made up an anti-Semitism scandal in the Labour Party.
I have an anti-Semitism cartoon to share. What's the difference?
That's very little.
Is it too little? Hey, don't ever yell.
I'm old.
You're on a panel with a bunch of the last thing we want to hear is women yell out. That's very too little.
Like, I can't.
What's the difference between a Jew and a canoe? A canoe tips. And then But keep reading. He said, another person says, ain't that the fucking truth, Buster? And he says, I've been thinking about the Palestinians recently and how sad their situation is. And the person replies, dude, if you think I'm going to sit here and listen to that kind of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Thanks, because I thought that was going to territory but this is the thing, that they have completely They have upended the actual definition of anti-Semitism to only apply in certain circumstances to criticism of Israeli policy and of Zionism, which is a political ideology. I am 100% Jewish, and I am constantly called a traitor to my people. And it's because I criticize Zionism, which many Jews around the world do.
Just put a coexist bumper sticker on the back of that Subaru and you'll be fine in Berkeley.
Oh, hell no.
I want to kind of ask about sort of some of the broader conflicts that have been taking place, particularly with the escalation between Hamas and the Israeli authorities. To what extent are these conflicts, particularly, in terms of, Bibi's increasingly hard stance and also Hamas activity, to do with both Bibi and Hamas attempting to maintain positions of leadership within their respective spheres of political action? Particularly, obviously, within the Palestinian case, there's a crisis over the elections, and Hamas wants to be seen as kind of taking the lead in what is, in effect, kind of organic protest towards ongoing settler violence. And to what extent is this crisis, in a kind of bizarre way, are Hamas and Bibi feeding off each other in order to kind of like Bibi is attempting to sort of maintain power at a time where it looked as if he was perhaps going to be forced from power, and he needs to stay in power because of the criminal indictments again, and he's willing to drag the country into warfare over this. So it's kind of a two-sided question. So in what sense is Hamas's action less to do with about kind of resisting Israel and more to do with asserting leadership over the Palestinian movement? To what extent is Bibi deliberately provoking this violence in order to maintain power?
That's a huge question. So first things, this is not a power struggle between two equal parties. This is a settler colonizer, militarized, nuclear addled, client state of the West against an occupied population that has no air force, that has no ground troops. They don't have F-16s. They don't have tanks. They have very crudely made rockets. And Hamas isn't, lobbing these rockets, which are getting better and better, by the way, into areas because they want to show, that they want to prove themselves politically. This is a resistance action, which they are actually legally entitled to. As my colleague Tamara said this morning, she was like, Israel is the one with the choice. Israel has the choice every day. Like the meme, they wake up and choose violence, right? Israel has the choice to stop this right now, but they don't. They thrive on provocation. I mean, Benny Gantz, the so-called defenseman, the war minister of Israel, he made campaign ads boasting that he had committed war crimes in Gaza in 2014 when he was the commander of the Israeli military. I've killed a lot of Arabs, and I'll kill, he's basically like, I'll kill more for you. And this is how the Israeli political dynamic is right now, that candidates vying for power in the Israeli Knesset try to outdo each other with more, who can be the most violent in threatening Palestinians. It's not hyperbole. Look at Benny Gantz's, ad campaign, ads on YouTube. And today Benny Gantz came out and said, Gaza will burn. So Hamas, launching rockets, Palestinians who may not have any political, leanings. If you were Palestinian, I would be glad if someone was defending my community against this like nuclear addled, ultra-violent settler colony state. I mean, someone is like, oh, it's bad. Hamas shouldn't be launching rockets. It makes the Palestinian side, look, it's not going to garner them any sympathy. Oh, because the Palestinian rockets, sometimes, they go awry and they hit a field somewhere. All right, then give them precision guided weapons. Oh, you don't want Palestinians to have precision guided weapons or an air force? Okay, then let's boycott, divestment, and sanction. Oh, you don't want them to do that either? You just want them to sit there and die quietly, singing Kumbaya?
Isn't that actually an interesting point? In the sense that we can understand like why the anger that provokes the rocket attacks, but but ultimately it's a kind of futile gesture, and it's kind of does more harm than good, because it's bad PR and it usually doesn't do anything, and when it does something, it's just blowing some poor person, random citizen's house up. Whereas actually the real threat that Israel faces is not from rocket attacks, but the bigger threat is from sort of peaceful protests and movements like boycott and divest and sanctions. Those
like protests that happened a couple of years ago.
Those are both morally defensible and strategically speaking, it makes more sense. So the Hamas rocket attacks, we can I don't support those kind of like activities, although I understand why people would do them. They're actually counterproductive to the Palestinian cause in the sense that other types of resistance are and less violent.
But what are Palestinians supposed to do when they're being bombed? Well, are they just supposed to take it? This argument. I mean, nobody ever tells Israel that it's bad PR for them to keep bombing Palestinians.
A lot of people tell,
but not in the same way that people are demanding that of Hamas. Not in the same way.
Go ahead. Sorry. Cool.
So I don't really think that people demanding Palestinians or Israelis change their policies is that consequential either.
Yeah.
There's been an international movement, BDS, that has been telling Israel straight up, you've got to stop this. This is terrible. There's people who say that, I mean, you started this episode with Israel has no right to exist. So there's no shortage of criticism of Israel and no shortage of pointed criticism about apartheid, about land seizures. That's out there. They know. Yeah. They don't care. Similarly, Hamas hears the same, has heard the idea that these attacks are futile. There's Palestinian activists that they know that this isn't necessarily going to lead anywhere. And it strikes me as fairly clear what's going to happen and what the Israeli plan is, which is make Gaza uninhabitable, destroy every time there's a possible pretext, destroy more of the infrastructure, prevent anything from being rebuilt.
Yeah.
Eventually they'll leave or die. Either way is fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And meanwhile, in the West Bank, it's death by 1,000 cuts, settlement here, land seizures there, lawfare, things that are semi-deniable that don't look like dispossession, but eventually you end up with the same outcome. And you mentioned that the Israelis are the ones that wake up every day with a choice. Mm-hmm. And the question that I have there is, let's assume that there's a desire to stop. Maybe it's because you end up with a new generation of Israeli leadership that can't stomach what's necessary, the type of human suffering that comes with that policy. Maybe it's because of pressure from the outside world. They decide, okay, let's make peace. If one of the starting points of that peace process is that Israel has no right to exist, and that all of the territory, all of the land, all of the homes that have been taken by Israelis from Palestinians in the old mandate, as well as the sort of occupied territories. That has to be returned. There's a right of return. How can that peace process be viable at all for 3 million Israeli Jews, who are largely the descendants of the settlers who arrived, who have made homes there?
Yeah.
Now there have been Israelis that have kicked out Palestinian families that had been living there for generations, who have been living in that home for generations of their own.
Sure. I think it's not as complicated. I mean, let's talk about two things. One is reparations, right? So when Palestinians had their shit taken, they weren't compensated, right? So what if during some sort of like peace and reconciliation, I hate that, but some sort of process after Zionism falls, after Israel declares that it's not going to be an apartheid state anymore, and it's going to grant Palestinians, the equity and the justice that they have been fighting for 73 years. What if that happens? Okay, great. Reparations. Pay Palestinians for the shit you stole. You can work out the, property stuff later, but at least pay them for that. Secondly, geographically, there is more than enough room for everybody. I mean, there's something like 80% of the villages that Israel destroyed in 1948 are part of national parkland, right? I go there. Last time I was in Palestine, I was taking a delegation around, and we went to this like national park, which is built on the ruins of 5 different villages. And it's where Israelis go and have picnics. They have picnics on somebody's fucking foundation of their house. So the land is still there. Palestinians just have not been able to ever visit. And if that was turned on its head, the Palestinians were given the right to even go there and visit their land. Let alone like reroute themselves there. I mean, that would be a starting point. It's not impossible. It's not impossible.
This is like a kind of final question I want to ask them is about like the ultimate solution. The formal Palestinian leadership, whether it's in the PLO or in Hamas, I believe, well, not Hamas per se, but de facto in Hamas, are still committed to a 2-state solution, right? And of course, as we know, even though nobody believes Bibi anymore, Israel is formally committed to a 2-state solution. Given the fundamental demographic transformations that have taken place, particularly in the last 30 years in the West Bank, is that even really possible?
No.
And the follow-up question to that is that, are we at a point in a kind of limbo where, Palestinians haven't given up, or at least the formal leadership hasn't given up the right to national self-determination, and have accepted Israel within Green Line borders and are like, we just want West Bank and Gaza Strip as sovereign states. But that is kind of, and liberal Zionists are still saying like, well, Bibi's bad, but let's go back to the 2-state solution.
Right. No, it's a very
delusion or acting in bad faith.
No, absolute delusion. It's not even a delusion. No, it's a deliberate way to kick the can down the road another decade. We're committed to this. Justin Trudeau said this yesterday. We're not going to stop arms sales to Israel. We're committed to the 2-state solution. What does that mean? Right? Talks to have talks about talks, to have meetings about talks. Meanwhile, facts on the ground are exploding. Settlements are expanding, by the day. Palestinians are being kicked off their land, killed. Their property is being demolished, right? 2 states, what 2 states? The settlements are there. You look at a map, you just look at a map. Like, there is no way that there could ever be a 2 states. And also that still gives Israel a pass for taking Palestinians' land, right? 2-state solution, if you look at like the Jared Kushner plan, hilarious, right? Part of the plan was that God, it was so phenomenal reading this. Like it was like reading someone's fever dream in a script. It was insane. One of them was like, Palestinians can have their little state, but Israel gets to still control the land, air, and sea borders, right? And still gets to kind of, have the final say in economic structures. They can never have their right of return. They can never have compensation for their destroyed and seized property. So if you give up those rights, which are fundamental to every single human being on this planet, then you get what? You get a little Bantustan that Israel still gets to control.
I mean, the reservations.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
The irony is, Cooper and I have a mutual friend who I argue with about this all the time. And it's like, you don't believe in two states. A state without a military can't be a sovereign state. It's like, well, do you expect the Israelis to give them a military? That would be insane. It's like, well, then you're not saying that they can have a state, right? You're saying they can have some kind of autonomy.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of bizarre kind of.
Well, it's racist. It's just racist. It's accepting this narrative that Israelis are somehow more evolved and more entitled to certain political dynamics, to certain property rights, to certain, to have a military that's, one of the largest and most sophisticated in the world, to have surveillance technology. And Palestinians, I don't really want to give them rockets.
Hold on, Cuba. We've gone an hour. And I know you want to go longer. But
I can talk about this all day.
Is Daddy Pascal coming? Is Big Daddy Pascal?
Pascal is silent right now. So. I do have a question for Nora, and I am putting you on the spot a little bit.
Oh God.
Can you stick around maybe for a little bit longer?
A little bit. I do have a son that needs to be put down to bed, but so I'm 15 minutes.
That was a very telling pause. Put down.
Put down. No.
How old is your son?
He's 5.
Oh, he's 5. I have a 2-year-old, and Jason has a 3-year-old.
He's going to be 3 in August. He is downstairs right now.
The little ones they're so cute.
Yes. Well,
while we were talking, I can hear him at the door. I want to open the door, but he's learned to open the door now. So I can open the door.
Yeah, be careful.
So Nora, you can find Nora at the Electronic Intifada and also on the Brief Podcast. There are links in the description to wherever you're watching this stream. To what she does. Before we go, I wanted to leave with a passage from a book by Chris Hedges.
Oh, I love him.
From a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. Have you ever read this book, Kuba?
I've read
this book.
I enjoyed it before.
It's not long. It's a short book.
It's pretty short.
Really good.
And this is about nationalism, the plague of nationalism. To speak of the Israeli War of Independence with many Israelis, in which stateless European Jews established a country in a land that had been primarily Muslim since the 7th century, is to shout into a vast black hole. There is an emotional barrier, a desire not to tarnish the creation myth, which makes it difficult for many Israeli Jews, including some of the most liberal and progressive, to acknowledge the profound injustice the creation of the State of Israel meant for Palestinians. As Americans, we struggle with these myths as well, only grudgingly conceding that many of our founding fathers were slave owners and much of our nation acquired after a genocidal campaign against Native Americans.
Yeah.
So
Israel learned from the U.S. And that cannot be overstated. That Israel learned settler colonization from the United States.
I mean, I agree with a lot of that, but I think that he's focusing on the wrong myths. He's criticizing nationalism, but the real myth is justice.
Good point.
Well, on that note, if you guys are patrons, there is a link already up on Patreon for the bonus half where we get a few more minutes of Nora. We'll see if we can twist her arm to stay a little bit longer.
My cat doesn't pull all the books off the bookshelf.
So thank you guys, and we are out.